Well, joining me to discuss the Mexican protest as it compares to protests that are now a trend among Generation Z in relation to government failure that's in governance is Dr. Kari Odermann. She's a global affairs expert. Good to have you this weekend, Dr. Kari. You just saw Sheinbaum's response to the protest. Her statement sort of undermines these movements by the youths. What's your take on this?
I think her statements are part of an identifiable pattern that's often tied to these movements that are social media based and grow very quickly. There is a healthy amount of suspicion behind them because how these movements can be manipulated. Unfortunately, that takes away some of the credibility that justified credibility of these movements. And it is a technique that can be used to make sure society stays safe, but can also be used to downplay the truth.
So how do Mexico's protests compare to those in Nepal, and what do they reveal about governance and accountability in these countries?
Well, we need to establish that in the past 2 years, there have been more demonstrations by young people than any time in the past 10 to 15 years. And there are some factors that are common among them. And if you look particularly at Nepal and Mexico, there was issues about unemployment and certain freedoms, but there's not a lot of overlap in terms of governance and how the protests were addressed. Now, in Mexico, of course, we don't know what's going to happen yet. The result in Nepal was the prime minister and several ministers ended up stepping down, and the minister of justice is now the interim prime minister, and elections will be held in March. What's going to happen in Mexico, we're only going to see in the next few months. But we need to keep in mind that Claudia Sheinbaum was only elected in October 2024. She campaigned on a lot of the issues that are part of these protests. And the political structures in Mexico actually set Sheinbaum up to be more successful with reforms that would placate or make the protesters more satisfied. She's the president of Mexico. She can only serve one 6-year term, means that she could actually accomplish a lot without having to worry about getting reelected. Of course, there are party politics in the background, but it makes it easier for her to do sweeping reforms. Keeping that in mind, though, she's only been in power for a year, and it is somewhat unrealistic to have expected her to accomplish very much in just 13 months.
So in follow-up to that response, how does her leadership style, impact Mexico in general?
Well, she's one of the few female world leaders that we have right now. Japan has just elected a female prime minister. But as I was looking into this topic, I thought there would be a correlation between protests, the likelihood of people to protest, and levels of democracy in countries. And actually, there is no correlation for why people protest between the amount of freedom that they have. As a matter of fact, the protests in Peru, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Madagascar, Kenya, even Ukraine, most of those countries are not considered free. They're only considered partially free. So the form of government and the form of governing has little influence. Sheinbaum herself, though, just at the beginning of November, was groped in public, and she has decided to press charges. And how women are treated in Mexico has been one of the topics of safety of these protests in Mexico City and throughout. So there is some overlap with her personal experience and what she could represent. But as we saw in the video leading up to our conversation, it seems like many people are very fed up.
So how do the high rates of femicide and violence, against women in Mexico impact the country's social and economic development? You raised the facts about how that, she's been harassed herself. I remember right before her, election, and there was a lot that happened. So femicide, violence in Mexico, can you speak to that?
Well, we know the numbers. Any country where women aren't treated right have between 1 and almost 4% less growth in their GDP. So that Mexico needs to tackle what has been a systemic problem of violence against women is clear if they want to succeed. And right now, as it looks like we might be going into a global recession, not allowing your society to be able to work and feel safe at work to their full potential is really not going to help anyone. Because this is an overlapping issue with what the protesters are doing, you would think that this would be something that the protesters would embrace more and use that because it aligns with security, internal security in general. But I'm not picking up a lot of the women's issues. They are integrated somewhat, but they're not in the forefront of these protests.
So let me try to broaden this conversation we're having a little bit. I wonder what you think about what we've learned from successful youth-led movements like the 2017 to 2018 Iranian protests or the 2020 to 2021 Belarus protests.
Well, we've learned that social media, especially since 2020, is a great tool for spreading information, but it's also a double-sided sword because the same things that make social media safe and easy to use to organize protests or for political dissidents to use can also be weaponized. Of course, we spoke about how there can be doubt if it's being leveraged for hybrid warfare or by other malicious actors to make a protest less credible. But you also have to wonder about what the anonymity, not knowing who's behind messages, can do to a cause. If someone could interject themselves into there and amplify it in a way where violence is being encouraged for otherwise peaceful protesters. And it depends really on how much data security and what kind of guardrails these social media platforms have. Because many people have experienced this now going into the United States, that they'll have their phone checked and what they've said in social media in the past could be used against them. And of course, what protesters do and say on social media may at some time also be used against them. And the technology to monitor what's happening on social media, also with facial recognition, can be used against protesters. And this is seen often because when there are protests in countries with stricter laws about the control of the internet, sometimes streaming options on apps are shut off. Sometimes the internet is completely shut down, or some platforms go dark.
Right. Now, before I let you go, Dr. Kari, how will global youth protests shape the future of international politics, and what does the social media play in all of this? I'm glad you brought in the issue of social media because it's like wildfire. Once, there's dissatisfaction, social media, the fire starts on from there, and then before you know, it spreads across a particular country. I know of what's been happening in Africa with Tanzania, and there's been several movements. So how's the role of the social media movements shape, all international politics as in the future?
Look, young people are on social media. Young people have every right to be unhappy. Unemployment in all of these countries that have experienced these youth protests in the past 2 years is high. In Kenya, it's over 60%. And young people, because of the lowering birth rate in some areas, face a huge burden to support their societies. And we have to look at what's going on around the world right now. You have many countries, especially in Europe, reconsidering military conscription, something that maybe many young people don't want to be involved with and don't think is fair. So it is very important for organizing these protests and getting people together quickly and having movements grow large. But it is something that needs to have some type of societal agreement about protections. So fake news and hybrid warfare isn't leveraged to destabilize society. Now, this generation, Generation Z, that was born between 19 97 and I think 2010, they grew up with touchscreens. They grew up with the internet, and they are a lot smarter than the other older generations about how to spot what's legitimate and not legitimate. But this is something that they have to be very, very vigilant about, because if internal stability happens in a country, they have to focus resources towards that. And that means that it distracts from pushing capacity towards defense, for example. And there is evidence that, especially in Francophone Africa and the Asia, the two areas where there's been the most of these youth protests, there's been influence from Russia or China. So these are things that need to be considered. And also, it's very, very important to note that these tactics have always existed. Western governments do them too, but they're only going to be picking up. And international organizations and outside countries, all they can do is make sure that there's a spotlight that stays on these protests so outside people can observe them. And social media is also the perfect medium for that.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Kari Odermann, for joining me on Arise America today. She's a global affairs expert.